Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'll be going over the complete history of the Dallas Cowboys, including several intriguing facts such as how they managed to blackmail their way into the NFL and how they became America's team. Before I get into it, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. If you act fast, you may get the honor of being the 5,051st subscriber. If you act slow, then I guess not. But back to the video. The history of the Cowboys all started with a familiar name in NFL history, and that is Lamar Hunt. He really wanted an NFL team in Dallas. And the NFL at the time just didn't really want to expand. Lamar Hunt, being a good businessman, seen an opportunity, started the Dallas Texans in Dallas, but in the AFL. This made the NFL fairly upset, and in response, the NFL became a little bit more open-minded towards the team being in Dallas. In 1958, a rich oil man named Clint Murchison decided, hey, I think a team should be in Dallas. He actually went to purchase the Washington Redskins. However, at the last second, Marshall, the former owner of the Redskins, changed the terms. Murchison backed out. He said, this is ridiculous. We had a deal.
No, but that's not fair.
Well, that's Dallas. Dallas indeed.
They start hating each other before the teams even both exist. 2 years later, Murchison had continued trying to make an NFL team in Dallas, and he had finally gained some momentum. However, Marshall was still in his way because at the time, the Redskins were the furthest south team in the NFL. So even though they're in DC, there were no teams below them. This allowed them to kind of own the South as territory for their fan base, and of course they really enjoyed this. But Murchison did find a way. So the owner of the song "Hail to the Redskins," which was the song that the Redskins were famous for, it's what they would play at their stadium. The owner of the song and the owner of the Redskins got into a fight, and in the end, Murchison, the person planning to make the Cowboys, bought the song. So Murchison went to the Redskins and said, hey, if you don't let me be an NFL team, I am taking away your team song that you were famous for. It's going to be pretty embarrassing.
You can't play a blackmail card and call a proxy meeting in the same turn. Why not?
After this, the Redskins relented, and Murchison was allowed to make his NFL team. And this really started the rivalry between the two teams instantly. After Murchison had gotten approval to make an NFL team in Dallas, he went through a few name choices, such as the Steers, which I think is a pretty bad name, the Rangers, which is a good name, but that's actually the baseball team, so that didn't work out, and then they ended up with the Cowboys. After they had all that sorted out, they picked a pretty good first head coach, one of the best ever first head coaches, really in my opinion, and that's Tom Landry. Of course, as I'm sure you probably know, Tom Landry went on to be their coach of the team for 29 years and is in the Hall of Fame. Going into the first years of the Cowboys, they had a pretty bad year. They were 0-11-1, and this was due largely to the fact that they had started after the college draft. So essentially, they had a very bad talent pool to start with, and they were building from zero. And not even like building from bricks, they didn't even have bricks. They were building from dirt. In the Cowboys' first year in the NFL, they were in the Western Conference. So at the time, there was just the Eastern and the Western. They were in the Western, not with the Eagles, not with the Giants, not with the Redskins. The following year, in 1961, the Minnesota Vikings joined the NFL, and at the time it was thought that the Vikings would be a better fit in the West and the Cowboys would be a better fit in the East. This is due to the fact that the Vikings were kind of surrounded by the Bears, the Lions, the Packers, and due to the fact that the Cowboys wanted to play in the big markets such as New York, Philadelphia, DC, and they already had a rivalry with the Redskins. So this is the real reason how the Cowboys got to be in the East, even though they are nowhere near the rest of the NFC East. In these 6 years of the Cowboys' history in 1965, they finally accomplished a big accomplishment for any new NFL team, and that is their first 500 season. They finished 7-7, big accomplishment.
Way to go, dude. I can't believe you pulled it off.
I mean, this is like a few years ago. You told the Browns they would go 7-7. They celebrated it at the time, but they were still on the way up. In 1966, the Dallas Cowboys, led by their improving quarterback Don Meredith, were actually able to make some postseason success. They won the Eastern Division, and they lost to the Packers in the NFL Championship game. However, it was the Packers. They were an all-time great team, and it was a close game. It was 34-27. In this year, Tom Landry even won Coach of the Year. The following year in 1967, the Cowboys had another good year. They went 9-5. They won their first playoff game, and then they lost in the NFL Championship to the Packers once again. The next 2 years, 1968 and 1969, the Cowboys continued to be a powerhouse in the NFL, going 12-2 and 11-2. However, they weren't able to make it far in the playoffs, losing right away to the Browns. Then in 1970, the Cowboys had another really good year, and they even made it to the Super Bowl. However, they came up a little bit short. They lost 16-13 to the Colts. And there is a fun fact about this. While it's not only the first Super Bowl appearance for the Cowboys, it is also one of those rare occurrences where the losing team has the Super Bowl MVP. So Chuck Howley on the defense of the losing team, the Cowboys, had 2 interceptions and a forced fumble, and he got the MVP in a loss. Probably would never see that in a game today, but it is a bit of a fun fact. Then in 1971, halfway through the year, even though they had just made it to the Super Bowl and almost won the previous year, they decided to change quarterbacks, going with Roger Staubach, and this was a pretty bold move, but it ended up being an amazing move because that year they went on a 7-game win streak to end the season. They won the Super Bowl versus the Dolphins, and Staubach ended up the MVP. So they had back-to-back MVPs, maybe not back-to-back Super Bowl champions, but they were well on their way. The next 2 years, of course, the Cowboys had really good seasons. They were loaded with talent. However, they lost the NFC Championship game twice, once to the Redskins, once to the Vikings. In 1977, the Cowboys, once again, this was just one of their decades, which they had multiple of, but this was one of their decades. They made it to the Super Bowl again, and they won the Super Bowl, beating the Broncos, and this was another bit of a rare occurrence, as it is with Cowboys and Super Bowl MVPs, and they had co-Super Bowl MVPs that year. They were just both so great, couldn't just pick one, so they picked 2. That was Randy White and Harvey Martin. And it may seem like I'm going a little quick through all these excellent Super Bowl winning years for the Cowboys, but to be honest, in their early years, they just had so many. If I went in depth on every season, this video would take too long. So I'll make sure to mention all of their Super Bowls, of course, but I can't go too in depth because they've been to 8. But anyways, the following year in 1978, they made it to the Super Bowl once again. However, in this one, they lost to the Steelers. This was their 5th Super Bowl appearance. However, even though the Cowboys did lose in 1978, this was a big milestone for the team because in 1978 was when they were coined as America's team. In 1978, Bob Ryan, an NFL Films editor, dubbed the Cowboys America's team. At the time, there were lots of highlight videos that would come out, not on like YouTube, but TV, And during this is when they were called America's team. It stuck. Of course, the owner of the Cowboys loved the name, so he kept it. The NFL liked it because it's good to have a popular team. Just ask the NBA with the Lakers. And it was kind of a marriage between them, mixed with them getting great ratings since they were so good and since they played many big market teams such as the Redskins, the Giants, the Eagles. And then the final piece almost to the Cowboys becoming America's team puzzle was the fact that they had been playing on Thanksgiving Day. And if you ask yourself, hey, how did they manage to do this? Well, it had always been a Lions thing. The NFL decided why don't we add a second team? So in 1966, they got that. It was seen as a bit of a risky move because everyone thought everyone would just want to be at home during Thanksgiving. Dallas fans surprised everyone and just said, hey, I don't want to be at home for Thanksgiving. I want to be at a football game. And thus the tradition continued, except for 1975 and 1977 when it was given to the Cardinals to get them to grow, hopefully. But the Cowboys said, hey, that's not nice. Give that back. And ever since then, the Cowboys have had a guaranteed Thanksgiving Day game, which has helped grow them even more, just putting them on the spotlight. And even today, you can hardly turn ESPN on without seeing the Cowboys, even though they've been terrible for years. But back to the Cowboys' actual history. After the Super Bowl loss in 1978, they did have a bit of a downturn, surprising for America's team. Not a big downturn, they were still a really good team, however they stopped making it to the Super Bowl. So in 1980, they lost to the Eagles in the NFC Championship game. In 1981, they lost to the 49ers in the NFC Championship game. This was 28-27, close game. In 1982, they lost to the Redskins in the championship game. They were like a slightly worse version of the Bills, making it to the Super Bowl and losing, or the Vikings, but making it to the championship game and losing. However, you can make up for that because, well, they had 5 Super Bowl appearances already and multiple Super Bowl victories. At the end of all these playoff runs, in 1984, the owner of the Cowboys decided, hey, you know what, I've had a long run, time to sell the team, and Bum Bright, quite the name, another oil man in Texas, bought the team with a group of people in 1984. However, this was not the winning team that he thought he would have. They went on to have several bad seasons, not even just for the Cowboys, but even for an NFL team. So in 1989, coming at the end of the worst season yet of 3-13, combined with these savings and loans crisis, Bum Bright and his ownership group ran out of money and he needed some. So he's like, hey, I guess I own the Cowboys, so I could sell that, I guess. And he sold it to none other than Jerry Jones for $150 million. And man, the ROI on that buy by Jerry Jones has been incredible because it's worth billions and billions and billions at this point. Jerry Jones, of course, had loved the team, but he had made some immediate changes that probably had to be done, including firing Tom Landry and hiring an excellent coach in Jimmy Johnson, really revitalizing the brand. Jimmy Johnson was, of course, the excellent head coach at the University of Miami, and he was also the teammate of Jerry Jones at the University of Arkansas. In his first year as head coach, they drafted Troy Aikman, you might have heard of him, another excellent NFL quarterback, and then had a humongous trade that changed the NFL forever. And it is the Hershel Walker trade. So Hershel Walker was an all-star running back, one of the best running backs in the NFL. This was at a time when running back was arguably the most important position in the NFL. So they traded him. It shocked the world. And it was to the Vikings, and it was for several players. However, there was some offsetting languages where if the Cowboys would cut these players, they would get draft picks instead. The Vikings did not think about this because it had never been done before, but Jimmy Johnson did. And they traded for him. They cut pretty much all the players. They ended up with 8 draft picks, including the Vikings' next 3 first-round picks. And they managed to hit on pretty much all of these picks and sent the Cowboys way into the future with a team that was loaded and full of talent. It did take these teams a bit of a minute to get going. So in 1989, first season, they did go 1-15. Of course, they had kind of traded away their best players and were just waiting on the future. In 1990, they had 700% the wins of the previous year. They went 7-9, and that was seen as impressive enough to give Jimmy Johnson the Coach of the Year and Emmitt Smith, the running back, the Offensive Rookie of the Year titles. So even though there was only 7 wins, it was seen as impressive at the time, and they just kept on improving by a lot. So in 1991, they went 11-5, won the wild card game, lost to the Lions in the divisional round. But then in 1992 and 1993, the Cowboys had some excellent seasons, and this is back-to-back Super Bowl championships, both over the Bills, both blowouts. Troy Aikman got the Super Bowl MVP in one, Emmitt Smith got it in another. This was really, in my opinion, what solidified the Cowboys as America's team, because not only in the 70s were they, so that was one generation, then they also were dominant in the 90s, so they had two different generations of fans across the world because of how good they were, how often they were on TV, and of course the Cowboys, just with their marketing, America's team, at the time, it seemed like a patriotic thing to do is to cheer for America's team. However, after the Super Bowl in 1993, this is where Jerry Jones started to ruin the Cowboys, and it only took him a few years, although he did have 2 Super Bowl wins. There was humongous amounts of friction between Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson, the coach. And shortly after the second Super Bowl win in a row, Jimmy Johnson stunned the world and resigned. So this was largely due to the fact that they just didn't get along, because Jerry Jones, as we know today, likes to kind of run the Cowboys how he likes to run the Cowboys. He wants all the credit. He wants to make all the decisions. Jimmy Johnson was not okay with that, and of course Jimmy Johnson was getting the credit because he was the coach. So due to this conflict, they broke up, and honestly, it does not seem like they've even forgiven each other to this day. In 1994, they hired Barry Switzer, who was an okay head coach, but honestly, he had an absolutely loaded team. They lost the NFC Championship game in 94, and then won the Cowboys' last Super Bowl ever in 1995 with Larry Brown as the Super Bowl MVP. If you would have told anybody in 1995 that this would be the last Cowboys Super Bowl appearance, there is no chance that anyone would have believed you. However, due to several different facts that I'll go over throughout the rest of this video, they've just had absolutely no playoff success since then. So instead of talking about their Super Bowl victories, I'll talk about their playoff disappointments from here on. And Barry Switzer, he didn't really last too long. So after he'd won the Super Bowl in 95, the next year he lost in the divisional round. And then in 1997, he went 6-10. And after that disappointing year, which involved losing 6 games in a row, Switzer resigned and they moved on to some new coaches. The next 2 coaches were Chan Gailey and Dave Campo, and they were both average to bad NFL head coaches. Neither of them won a playoff game, of course. In 2003, Jerry Jones says, hey, I'm going to make a big swing. I'm going to bring this team back to glory. And he hired Bill Parcells, arguably the best coach in the NFL. However, even though Bill Parcells had a history of being an excellent quarterback, he was old at the time, and he also didn't get along great with Jerry Jones because Jerry Jones still wanted all the credit. In 2006, what ended up being the end of Bill Parcells' career with the Cowboys, they actually ended on a hot streak. So Bill Parcells still had some coaching chops. They signed T.O., the controversial wide receiver, and they named Tony Romo as the starter midway through the year, and Romo started playing very well. Romo ended up 5-1 as a starting quarterback that year. They went to play the Seattle Seahawks in the playoffs, and this was the famous Tony Romo fumbling the snap on the field goal game where they would have won if he didn't drop the snap. However, he did drop it, and they lost 21-20. And this, to me, seemed to be showing the downfall of the Cowboys on the national stage, not being a Super Bowl winning team, but a bit of an embarrassment. In 2007, it seemed like they had kind of put everything together. They had Wade Phillips, Tony Romo, of course, and they started the year winning their first 5 games and won the NFC East. However, in the playoffs, they lost to the divisional rival, the Giants, who of course would go on to win the Super Bowl, so that season hurt them a good bit. In 2008, coming off this promising year, it was a bit of an up and down year with Romo getting hurt a few times throughout the year. They ended up only being 9-7 and missing playoffs, but then in 2009, they emerged once again. They were 11-5. The Cowboys were back. They even managed to win a playoff game over the Eagles, and they won by a lot. However, then they got destroyed by the Brett Favre Vikings, 34-3. And all of what had been built up to appear to be the old Cowboys back again vanished overnight, because in 2010 they started the year 1-7 and they fired Phillips and they hired Jason Garrett. Of course, the standard for mediocrity in the NFL. Now, he wasn't all that bad. He had some ups and downs. He even won a wild card game at one point in 2014. However, Jason Garrett's time with the Cowboys was kind of centered around being an okay team. They went 8-8 a bunch. They even went 10-6 a few times, 12-4. But when they would get to the playoffs, they would crumble year in and year out. And from 2010 to 2019, his whole time there, they actually only ended up winning 2 wild card games, never made it past the divisional round of the playoffs, and this is a very proud organization, and this hurt them pretty dearly. This was even with good quarterbacks such as Tony Romo, who had been dropped into their lap, and then once again with Dak Prescott, who also got dropped into their lap, a later round quarterback who comes out of nowhere and plays extremely well, but for one reason or another, they just kept on losing in the playoffs. In 2020, Jerry Jones finally decided, I guess it's time to get rid of Jason Garrett, even though this is one of the cases where he didn't get rid of him because of his personality. He loved his personality. He got rid of him because the on-the-field product was just not good enough, which is what you would think all coaches would be fired for. But with Jerry Jones, personality, letting Jerry Jones do what Jerry Jones wants matters a lot to him too. In 2020, they hired Mike McCarthy, a decent coach. And he had many years in the NFL, kind of saying that he'd been brought up by the talent around him in Green Bay. However, he has won a Super Bowl, and he's not actually that bad of a coach. He went 6-10 his first year. In his first year, they did lose Dak Prescott to an injury, but in the following 3 years, the Cowboys went 12-5 every single year. Those are some pretty good seasons, in my opinion. However, once again, it's just embarrassing playoff losses, including the worst, in my opinion, was the blowout against the Packers that happened in 2023. Finally, to get to modern day, last year, the Cowboys once again were a bit of a failure, and it hurts even more when you see your divisional rival, the Eagles, go on to win the Super Bowl. So they fired him as well, and now they have Brian Schottenheimer, a longtime assistant coach in the NFL, but someone who he wasn't really high up on most people's list of NFL quarterbacks. We'll see how it ends up, but a lot of people are honestly not too hopeful. To sum it up, their off-the-field product and ability to market themselves way overshadows their actual on-the-field product. So what are your thoughts on the Cowboys? Leave any thoughts in the comment section down below. Subscribe for more content and like the video. I'll see you later. Bye.